Reva's introduction offered one of the most compelling narrative opportunities in modern Star Wars because her origins bridged the two eras that shaped the entire franchise. She was born into the Jedi Order, raised under its discipline, and nearly killed by the Chosen One during its collapse. That background gave her a perspective no other character possessed. She wasn't defined by belief, doctrine, or prophecy. She was defined by survival, which gave her an authenticity far removed from traditional Jedi or Sith archetypes. Her experience as a youngling provided a rare window into the human cost of Order 66. Most depictions of the Purge focus on Jedi Masters, clone troopers, or political consequences. Reva represented the forgotten demographic, the children caught between an institution collapsing and an empire rising. She wasn't a soldier or an apprentice. She was a victim who grew into an antagonist, which is a trajectory ripe for layered conflict and psychological depth. The idea of a Padawan who turns to the Inquisitors, not out of ideological corruption, but out of personal vendetta, reframed what the dark side could mean. Reva wasn't seduced by power or manipulated by promises. She made a conscious choice to infiltrate the Empire because she believed vengeance required proximity. Unlike typical villains, she didn't seek control. She sought opportunity. That distinction made her more interesting than many Sith successors. Her relationship to Darth Vader carried built-in tension that the show barely touched. She was one of the last living witnesses to Anakin's betrayal, and that alone positioned her as a quiet threat within the Inquisitorius. The potential for Reva to move through the ranks while hiding her hatred could have created a subplot of suspense paralleling the larger Obi-Wan narrative. Instead of serving Vader, she could have functioned as a time bomb waiting to expose her purpose. Her dynamic with Obi-Wan offered even deeper narrative potential. Reva was a direct consequence of his failure, a living reminder of the lives destroyed because he could not stop Anakin's fall. Most characters confront Kenobi as a legendary general or a former Jedi Master. Reva confronted him as someone whose childhood ended the day he walked away from the temple. Her anger was personal, not political, and that personal angle could have driven some of the richest emotional scenes in the series. She also carried a thematic role that aligned perfectly with Kenobi's arc. Obi-Wan spent the show running from his past, while Reva represented a past that refused to stay buried. Her existence alone challenged his desire to detach from the galaxy's suffering. She forced him to confront the idea that his guilt had consequences beyond his own isolation. That parallel could have connected their arcs into a larger commentary on responsibility and the weight of failure. The trauma underpinning Reva's personality had clear narrative logic. Her aggression, intensity, and fixation on Kenobi all stem from the psychological scars of witnessing the Jedi Temple massacre. Those behaviours shouldn't have been framed as villainous theatrics. They were symptoms of a childhood shaped by survival. Reva was the first Star Wars character to treat the trauma of Order 66 not as a tragic memory, but as a lived wound that dictated her every choice. Reva's emotional volatility made her one of the few characters capable of exploring what happens when someone internalizes Jedi teachings without ever having the chance to complete them. She had the discipline to survive, the fear to harden her identity, and the skill to pursue her goals relentlessly. That blend should have made her a study in how fragmented Jedi philosophy becomes when a child absorbs it without guidance or closure. Her anger toward the Jedi Order had legitimacy built into the concept. She didn't blame the Sith for the Temple massacre because she witnessed a Jedi Knight, someone she trusted, become the perpetrator. That trauma complicates her worldview, allowing her to condemn both sides without falling neatly into either. She had philosophical tension built into her identity, the type of tension that could have produced meaningful conversations about the failures of institutions rather than simple hero-villain dynamics. Reva's infiltration of the Inquisitors as a long-term revenge plan is one of the most sophisticated character premises Star Wars has ever introduced. It mirrors undercover narratives in political thrillers, while aligning with the franchise's themes of corruption and identity. A revenge-driven mole operating inside the Empire could have created a subplot of paranoia that elevated the entire show's tension. Her interactions with the Grand Inquisitor hinted at a layered power dynamic the show could have expanded. Reva's ambition wasn't hunger for authority, it was desperation to maintain her cover long enough to reach Vader. Her friction with the other Inquisitors could have served as a narrative engine, making every confrontation a balance between maintaining status and concealing purpose. Even her fixation on Obi-Wan had thematic weight. She saw him not as an enemy, but as a symbol of survival, a person who escaped the massacre that defined her trauma. Her resentment wasn't jealousy, it was projection. She survived alone while he lived hidden, and the show could have explored that resentment through character-driven dialogue instead of confrontational scenes dependent on plot twists. Reva's eventual confrontation with Luke had the potential to complete her arc thematically. She could have realised that she had become the same threat that once took her own childhood. That recognition should have represented the culmination of years of unresolved pain. Her sparing Luke had powerful symbolic potential. It could have shown her confronting the cycle of violence she had been trapped in since the temple. Reva was positioned to be a TA character who reflected the cost of the Jedi's downfall, the brutality of the Empire's rise, and the trauma of growing up in a galaxy defined by war. She had built-in motivation, conflict, and thematic resonance. She could have elevated Kenobi's arc, recontextualized Vader's legacy, and explored a human dimension of Star Wars rarely addressed. The potential wasn't just present, it was abundant. Reva's story suffered not because the concept was weak, but because the execution minimized everything that made her interesting. The show withheld her motivations to preserve mystery, but that decision deprived her of emotional grounding. Instead of understanding her anger from the beginning, the audience was left interpreting her intensity as one-note aggression. The reveal of her backstory arrived too late to reframe earlier scenes, creating a disconnect between intention and perception. Her revenge plot against Vader should have shaped every episode, but the show treated it as a late-stage twist rather than the core of her character. By hiding her true objective, the story limited her depth to surface-level antagonism. A character driven by childhood trauma and long-term infiltration deserves gradual development, not a sudden explanation delivered as exposition near the finale. The writing framed her decisions as erratic because the narrative withheld the logic behind them. One episode showed her hunting Kenobi with single-minded intensity. Another suggested she sought his help. Another revealed she wanted Vader dead. Those motivations do not contradict each other, but the show failed to contextualize the transitions. Instead of emotional conflict, the audience perceived inconsistency. Reva's position within the Inquisitorius was never explored meaningfully. Her rank, influence, and threats against fellow Inquisitors lacked the narrative setup necessary to make her authority convincing. Other Inquisitors earned their menace through behaviour, ideology, or history. Reva received none of that development. Without context, her confrontations felt abrupt rather than frightening. Her interactions with the Grand Inquisitor should have developed into a power struggle shaped by hidden motives. Instead, they played as isolated conflicts with little continuity. A narrative that acknowledged Reva's desperation and strategic risk-taking would have strengthened the tension. By ignoring those layers, the show reduced her to an antagonist who advanced the plot without influencing it. Reva's pursuit of Obi-Wan lacked the psychological nuance the premise required. She could have interrogated him about the temple, blamed him for surviving while others died, or challenged the Jedi's failures. Instead, their interactions centered on chasing, capturing, and escaping. The emotional substance of their shared history was frequently replaced by logistical movement. Her final confrontation with Luke felt abrupt because it lacked the emotional build-up necessary for a redemption arc. The idea of her recognizing her younger self in Luke is strong, but the show provided little introspection leading to that moment. Without internal conflict portrayed on screen, her choice felt like a thematic statement rather than a character decision grounded in her journey. Reva's potential interactions with Vader were similarly underdeveloped. A survivor confronting the man who destroyed her life should have carried dramatic weight. Instead, their relationship unfolded in fragments, and her attempt on his life occurred suddenly, without the internal escalation that would make the moment climactic. A confrontation, years in the making, felt condensed into minutes. The show rarely allowed Reva to process her trauma in meaningful ways. Scenes that could have explored memory, guilt, or fear were replaced with anger expressed through shouting or violence. Those expressions are valid, but without reflective moments, they fail to evolve her character. Star Wars thrives on internal turning points, and Reva's story needed those moments to feel complete. Her sudden pivot toward hunting Luke felt disconnected because the narrative didn't provide a clear psychological through line. The idea of repeating Vader's actions as a way of confronting her pain is compelling, but the show didn't articulate that logic. It made her appear directionless when she should have appeared haunted. A character driven by trauma was written as a character driven by plot. Reva's forgiveness scene with Obi-Wan symbolized closure, but closure requires accumulation. Her art lacked the narrative infrastructure to justify a moment meant to resolve years of conflict. Instead of feeling cathartic, it felt like a necessary endpoint placed at the end of an incomplete path. The emotion of the scene belonged to a version of the story that wasn't on screen. The show repeatedly prioritized nostalgia over character development, and Reva suffered most from that choice. Key screen time went to legacy characters or cameos that overshadowed her arc. Instead of being allowed to carry thematic weight, she became a structural tool used to move Kenobi and Vader into position for familiar story beats. Reva's performance had conviction, and the concept behind her character had sophistication, but the writing treated her as a mechanism instead of a person. Her trauma became a reveal, her motives became twists, her choices became plot requirements. She was never allowed to occupy the narrative with the complexity her premise deserved. Reva was not a failure of casting or concept. She was a casualty of a story designed around legacy moments rather than character exploration. She could have been a mirror to Obi-Wan, a challenge to Vader, and a representation of what happens to children left behind after institutional collapse. Instead, she was used as connective tissue in a show that didn't recognize the weight she carried. The potential was there. The writing simply didn't rise to meet it.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.